For me, and I suppose for thousands of other people, the Sir George Williams University and the name Henry F. Hall will always be associated and are almost synonymous. And it's not just for longevity that is true, but the fact is you have been at Sir George Williams for a long time, have you not? When did you arrive?
Well, Roby, it's nice to talk with you. I arrived on the staff at Sir George Williams College, as it was then, in the summer of 1926 as student counselor. And I left the staff at the end of 1966. So I was on the staff for exactly 40 and a half years.
Mm. Well, life begins at 40. We'll be interested in your new career now. I'm interested in the fact that you came as student counselor. This is about 30 years before most universities had anybody who had a function such as that, although I suppose the function had to be performed by someone.
Yes. I've always been impressed by the fact that the administration of those early days of what was a very small and intensely struggling institution felt that they could afford to appoint a student counselor. We didn't have a registrar. We didn't have a dean, but we did have a student counselor whose sole function, at least at first, was the counseling of students and prospective students, their parents, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So learning was central. What was Sir George Williams like then?
Well, of course, Sir George Williams then was a branch, and not a very big branch, of the YMCA of Montreal. As a matter of fact, the name Sir George Williams was assumed the day I came on the staff. Previous to that, it had been the Montreal YMCA Schools, and it consisted of a collection of more or less unrelated schools at the pre-college level, mostly, but not entirely, in the evening. The business school operated a day course and very successfully for many years, and still does, as a matter of fact, although its population now is, I guess, almost exclusively young women. In those days, its population was exclusively young men.
This grew until you had about 5 different divisions, if I remember correctly.
That's right. We had 4 in 1926. We added an art school to that, and there were 5 separate units. But none of this work was at the college level. Mm-hmm. That didn't start until the fall of 1929.
Oh, as early as that?
Yes.
And you began to grant degrees in the early 30s then?
That's right. Our first degrees were granted in the fall of 36, 2 degrees. And another class graduated, a class of 9 more graduated in the spring of 37.
I remember that graduation. Douglas Burns Clark was one of those.
That's right.
As well as a number of other distinguished people.
Yes, your revered brother, John Kidd, was a member of that class.
So that the university part of the work is relatively recent in the whole history of Sir George Williams. But of course,
relatively, yes, relatively.
I guess the greatest growth, though, has occurred in this era, and the growth in numbers must have been very large indeed.
Yes. The war, the Second World War, and the post-war period were times of tremendous growth in terms of percentages. These were the times of our greatest growth and the time during which we, I say we, I mean the college, gained some degree of recognition and became better known and more readily accepted.
Matter of fact, it seems to me you were granting degrees long before you had an official charter. Is that correct?
That's very true, and this is a strange situation. Uh, I don't know. I'm not sure, but it would seem to me this is your field, and you would probably know about this. But it seems probable that this institution was unique in that respect. We started, as we said, granting degrees in 36 and 37, and we didn't have a provincial charter mentioning the power to grant degrees until 1948.
I think that was true of some equally famous universities in Asia and the original ones in Europe.
Oh, yes.
They didn't apply for any license either.
Yes, yes.
Has the university in the main followed the same objectives, or have its purposes been similar all through this period, or has there been some adjustment, some evolution, some change in purpose?
Well, there has been a good deal of change, I think. Although I would hope that the fundamental purpose has not changed. As stated in our announcement and in several other publications, our purpose has been from the beginning and still is the development of people. Now, this, of course, is a very broad term and may mean anything or perhaps nothing, but it means a lot to me because my philosophy of education is that every one of us is different. Each one has his own peculiar and particular capacities and abilities, and to develop those capacities and abilities to the greatest degree possible, it would seem to me to be a valid educational aim for any institution. When we come to the question of how this is brought about, well then, of course, educationalists and people in general would differ a good deal.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the freedom of the what professors generally call academic freedom was early recognized at Sir George, and I hope that this has been followed as far as possible.
As I used to talk about my own experience here, people would comment on 2 or 3 points, which I thought every university was this way, but apparently they weren't. One is that I knew all the members of faculty. Well, now, I suppose this was partly because it was small.
Yes.
But one could know them all and know them well.
Yes.
Another was that people there was quite a disparity in ages. People had a chance of studying here.
Yes.
Even though they had missed out perhaps when they were 17, 18, or 19.
Well, I think this has been perhaps the certainly one of the leading reasons for existence of the institution, in that it has given opportunities to people who otherwise might not have had any opportunity for education, or at least higher education.
I remember, too, that many of my colleagues came from these so-called minority groups, and these were extremely well represented here.
Yes.
This was not true of all universities at this time.
No, I think this is true. One of the reasons is a very obvious one, that the cost was perhaps lower than it was in many other institutions, and maybe the opportunity of admission was quite broad. We are not by any means the only, but certainly one of the first college grade institutions in Canada to admit students on the basis of what we call a mature matriculation rather than the more traditional matriculation examination.
Fortunately, that practice is growing, but
Yes.
there's still the need for developing more organized ways for people of any age who have the
Yes.
capacity and will
Yes.
to do this.
Yes. Roby, to get back to your earlier question about the ways in which the institution has changed, I suppose you would agree that sheer growth is bound to have its effect. And it has many effects, some good and some not so good. It would be impossible for anyone, even the principal, to know all of the faculty now, whereas you say as an undergraduate, you knew them all in your day. And a greater size demands more organization, I suppose, more rules, perhaps more strict application of rules than was possible, than existed back in the days to which you refer.
Another factor which seemed to impress my friends was the number of what were then called experimental approaches to learning, the courses which surveyed broader fields, although not everyone approves of this.
No.
The first course in Canada on adult education, to cite an example from my own field.
Yes, yes.
The initiation of study discussion programs where
Yes.
a great level, a large amount of participation of these students was encouraged.
Yes, I think that's true. Again, as I was telling you earlier, my last year or two on the staff, after I retired from the principalship, I was fortunate enough to stay on as a professor for a few years, 4 to be exact. And these were some of my best years. And yet, in another way, they were very frustrating because I had very large classes in which the sort of thing to which you refer was impossible.
Simply not.
Although one would try to maintain personal contact, there's a limit.
Mm-hmm. You had a unique form of professional education here, too, and perhaps you still do, the preparation of people for the secretariatship of the YMCA?
Yes, so-called fellowship plan. This was developed independently, in a sense, of Sir George Williams and quite a few centers across Canada where there are universities and YMCAs in the same town or city have followed a fellowship plan. But the relatedness of Sir George Williams to the YMCA of Montreal naturally led to its becoming a sort of center in Canada for the education of YMCA secretaries. And this has gone very well on the whole. It was a good thing for the university in its earlier days, particularly in that it brought a good type of young men, and in some cases young women, from across the country who had interests in this field and who had a good deal to contribute to the university community as undergraduates. I think this is one of the great strengths in those early days. I'm glad to say, too, and you'd be interested in this, that this has developed a good deal so that other institutions beside the YMCA, including the Boys Clubs of Canada, now have fellowship students in the university on the same basis as the YMCA.
Well, I'm sure you'd be gratified about this. I think you yourself were the first of these fellows.
Yes, I guess I was in Canada.
And when you were at McGill University.
Yes, that's right.
You went to the university then right after World War I imagine.
Yes, about a year and a half after I got out of the Army, after World War One, I became an undergraduate, rather an old undergraduate for those days. It wasn't the custom then for people to have such a gap between high school and university. One of the things that I'm happy about, as I'm sure you are, is that this has become a more common practice in more recent years.
We know a good deal about the veterans of World War II, and indeed you organized and ran a complete college for them, didn't you, and then closed it down.
Yes, we had a preparatory school called the Claremont Division, called that because it happened to be on Claremont Avenue in Westmount, in which veterans who needed preparation before entering college courses were were able to secure this sort of preparation. This was under the direction of your good friend and my good friend, Dr. Ernie Stabler.
Ernie Stabler, yes. Seems to me that most big universities could still have that additional work, preparatory work, for some people who come in with certain deficiencies. But
There's
this
a
would
great
be,
demand for it.
yes, be a useful service.
I was just talking yesterday with a friend, as a matter of fact, who was starting a private school in the city for this purpose.
And I know of no older person who doesn't feel the need for something of this if they're returning, no matter how capable they are.
That's right.
They either
That's right.
lack learning skills or think they are and lack the confidence that
And one of the
require.
fears of mature people in going to university is that they have forgotten what they learned in high school. This is often exaggerated in the mind of the person, but there's a certain amount of validity in it that people do forget, particularly subject matter which has not been used.
Were there a good many of you who came back from World War I who went on to the university?
I suppose in toto there were a good many, but nothing like the percentage that there were in World War II.
What was your own plan when you came back?
My own vocational plan? Well, I didn't have any very clear-cut vocational plan. It sounds corny. It sounds what perhaps young people now would call square. But I had an idea that there was going to be a different world. And I had an idea that I somehow wanted to try to help people. And it seemed to me that the best way to help people, speaking in very broad terms, is to help themselves. And this, to me, is education. So I decided to become, if I could, some sort of an educationalist. In those days, the young science of psychology was very much in the scene, and counseling was a new discipline. In fact, so new that it was, as you have already suggested, scarcely recognized in many places. But I was fortunate enough to get some basic psychological training, including testing, that is the administration of tests, at McGill. And then I was fortunate enough to go for a short time to the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, where Dr. John Brewer was holding forth in those days, and he had a great influence on me, not only in the more technical aspects of counseling, because he didn't emphasize that, but more importantly, perhaps, in the broader concept of education and the concept of counseling and the place of counseling in the total educational process.
And that's really what fitted you for the role of student counselor.
Yes, the administrators in those days felt that that was true, and that I had had this sort of training, which would be considered very inadequate in these days, very inadequate indeed. But I had had the sort of training and interest in which they were interested, so they took a chance in hiring me for.
Now, later you became dean, and you became principal, and during the whole time you were teaching. You've always been a teacher.
That's true. I taught the first year I was at college, and I taught every year I was at the college. That's true. Yes, at least one course. This is a matter that there's a good deal of difference of opinion about, as you well know. I know university administrators, good ones too, who feel that they can't teach without neglecting their administration, and they can't administer without neglecting their teaching. And well, I think that there may be something in that. As I said before, we're all different. As an administrator, I'm afraid I neglected my administration to teach and to counsel.
Yes, I guess I would probably share your prejudices about this, that you can't really be involved in the educational process in any form unless you're pretty close to where learning is occurring, even if the time for that isn't as great as one wants.
Well, I've always felt that rather strongly.
Remember the last week in which Henry Marshall Torrey was alive. I was in New York, and he wrote me, and he asked me to do something for him. He was then 84.
Wow.
Why? Because this was good enough for a young person like me. He wanted to get on with the important things. He wanted to teach a new course in the philosophy of science.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to have taken that course, but there was no opportunity.
Well, I'm sure he held strongly to this philosophy that the administration should at least be closely aware of the learning.
Yes,
process.
he did, and people like Claude Bissell have and continue
Yes,
to.
Yes.
Well, Sir George Williams became the first, as far as I know, the first university created in a period of about 10 or 15 or 20 years. There may be exceptions, but I don't know of one. Did you, and it was new, and it had no great prestige, did you have trouble finding the faculty you needed?
Oh, yes, but perhaps not so much as would be the case now. The real growth of Sir George Williams, the early growth of Sir George Williams as a collegiate institution, coincided with the Depression. And this had a very detrimental effect in that anyone who knows the history knows that we lived from hand to mouth. We financed on the proverbial shoestring. But at the same time, it made available, sometimes on a full-time basis, but more often on a part-time basis, people of quality and caliber and interest that we could not have obtained in a more flourishing and affluent society. Yes, you're mentioning that we were unique. In that we developed, as far as Canada is concerned, in a period in which it wasn't the fashion to start new universities. And this has led me often to ponder the question as to whether Sir George Williams is the youngest of the old colleges or universities, or the oldest of the young ones. And my conclusion is that it is perhaps the youngest of the old ones. Now, this is a purely academic and semantic question. It doesn't mean anything except that the reason I say it's the youngest of the old ones is that we had some of the struggles that the old ones had, in that we had no government financing. In fact, one might go so far as to say no government interest, certainly no government control. We were just on our own. Just on our own.
It's hard for some people to remember these days. I've just, in visiting Antigonish, met a man who had been enrolled there at one time and had reported to the president that the doctor had ordered him to go and seek some treatment. And the old man said, well, if you must go, you must go, but come back soon, lad. We need your fees.
Yes, yes. Well, that's true. We needed the fees of students, although it must be said in all honesty that in the Depression days, some of them were a long time in being paid.
You were able, too, weren't you, for the evening classes to attract some really remarkable teachers on a part-time basis?
Yes, I think that this is one of the big advantages of an evening college. And certainly this is not peculiar to Sir George Williams. But I feel this is one of the big advantages of an evening institution in a big metropolitan center, that you have such a rich environment of specialists and people interested in various fields, some of them who are so interested that they're willing to teach almost for the experience of teaching the field that they happen to be interested in. Some of them are better than others, naturally, but I think you're right that this is true.
University was also very lucky in my view, in its first two principals. You were associated with both
Owen
of them.
Stritter and Dr. Kenneth Norris, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. They were remarkable men. Unfortunately, we lost Owen Stritter very early. In fact, Sir George hadn't granted a degree when he left us, and he died during World War II, still a young man. He was succeeded by Kenneth Norris, whom you know very well, and who was principal for 20 years.
If you were able to start a new career now, what do you think would be in?
Well, sometimes I think that if I had my life to live over again, I would like to be a biochemist, because I was thinking of this the other day when men were walking on the moon. This is a great, this broad and tremendously technical and interesting field has a great challenge. Probably I haven't enough real brain power to be a biochemist. I expect if I had my life to live over again, it would be still related to people pretty largely.
I think that's it.
Okay.